tap that so it's... I had to get the okay from James. Good evening, I'm Sue Bollier. Welcome to the Bias Speaker Series. Our sincere thanks to the Bias Foundation for sponsoring tonight's event. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the town of Duck for the use of the Keller Meeting Hall tonight. This evening's topic is North Carolina's changing coast. Our guest speaker is Dr. Reide Corbett. Dr. Corbett was born and raised in coastal North Carolina. After receiving his Ph.D. in oceanography from Florida State University and spending a short time at Tulane University in New Orleans, he returned to North Carolina to join the faculty at East Carolina University. He's now the Dean of Integrated Coastal Programs, the Executive Director of the Coastal Studies Institute, and a professor in the Department of Coastal Studies at ECU. Dr. Corbett is a coastal oceanographer and geochemist with an overall scientific interest in geochemical and geomorphic dynamics of coastal and open ocean environments. Dr. Corbett's research includes estuarine and continental shelf sediment dynamics, coastal change, and geomorphic evolution of coastal systems across telescoping timescales. As the Dean of Integrated Coastal Programs, Dr. Corbett leads an interdisciplinary team of faculty and staff from across ECU's campuses that integrate the fields of engineering, health, marine history, natural, and social sciences. ECU's integrated coastal programs are dedicated to transdisciplinary research, high-quality academic programs, and meaningful community engagement. This college-level academic program includes several relevant organizations, including the Coastal Studies Institute, a multi-institutional research and educational partnership of the UNC system, including North Carolina State University, UNC Chapel Hill, UNC Wilmington, and Elizabeth City State University. Based at the Coastal Studies Institute, the North Carolina Renewable Ocean Energy Program advances interdisciplinary marine energy solutions across UNC system partner colleges of engineering at NC State University, UNC Charlotte, and NC A&T University. Together, these organizations are dedicated to transdisciplinary research, high-quality academic programs, and meaningful community engagement. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Reide Corbett. Thank you.
I like to walk, and so I like a lapel mic or I like a handheld mic because I don't like to stand still. Thank you very much for the welcome. I am certainly happy to be here this evening. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you. I appreciate the invitation as part of the lecture series. I am a North Carolina native. I've lived in North Carolina most of my life. I left to get a couple of degrees. I was excited to come back to North Carolina as faculty at East Carolina University, and I was even more excited in 2012 to move out to the Outer Banks, a place that I visited a lot, skipped school to surf. So I was here a lot, and to actually come out here and live, to work, and to really, get to become a part of the community was, I really feel lucky to be able to do that, and really proud to be able to sort of come out and talk to you about some of the work that we are doing, some of the science that I think is really important to all of us. And so when I say all of us, it is me included. Today I live on Roanoke Island. I've lived in different towns across the Outer Banks. I'm a proud resident of Roanoke Island today. But we're all sort of facing some interesting challenges that offer opportunities in the not too distant future. In fact, we could talk about things that are happening today, literally today. As I sort of get into some of the topics today, I think it's important to recognize that some of the things I am talking about, it's not just my work. It is the work of my large research group over the years. It's work of many of my collaborators. So what I'm trying to do today is not answer the questions necessarily, although I'm certainly here to answer any of your questions, is to really provide some of the science, try to provide some of the context of the changes that we are seeing across the world, particularly in North Carolina, and think about some of the changes and challenges that do lie ahead for us as a coastal community. And then we can sort of get into, if you want, some of the opportunities maybe, where we are going in the way of climate change, sea level rise, and some of the challenges that they will bring. But first, I want to introduce you to where we are, where I'm located, which is the Coastal Studies Institute. The Coastal Studies Institute was established in 2003 and opened up this beautiful campus on Roanoke Island in late 2012, very early 2013. And so we've been on that campus for 10 years now. We are a partnership across, and so Sue already gave a lot of this introduction, so I'm going to sort of reiterate some of it. We are a partnership across 5 institutions, ECU being the lead institution, but we also have strong collaboration with UNC Chapel Hill, NC State University, UNC Wilmington, and Elizabeth City State University. And that partnership is really important. I have faculty at the Coastal Studies Institute from 3 different institutions. Most of them are from ECU, but I have faculty from NC State as well as Chapel Hill on our campus. And I think it's really important that North Carolina has invested in this campus, that has invested enough to put some faculty out here that are focused on coastal change. Not just in North Carolina, but around the globe. This is happening everywhere. The things that I'm talking about, again, I will focus in our backyard, but we are not alone. And so it's important that we do understand the science from a very broad context, not just our backyard, but really putting it in a perspective for those that are across this planet. At CSI, we do focus on some fairly broad topics, and so there list about 6 of the research areas that we do focus. Including coasts and people. So we do bring together the physical sciences with the social science. We do have engineers. We focused on coastal processes. That's a lot of my background, that physical science. Hydrology, we look at hazards. And an important program, and one of our larger programs, is this renewable energy program, which was established in 2011. And is really growing today, particularly in thinking about diversifying our energy needs beyond just those that are burning fossil fuels. And so the North Carolina Renewable Ocean Energy Program is a state-funded program, but we've grown that into a national program through some new awards from the Department of Energy. And so we not only have the North Carolina Renewable Ocean Energy Program, which is housed at the Coastal Studies Institute. It's a partnership across 3 other UNC institutions. But we also have the Atlantic Marine Energy Center, which is a national center funded by the Department of Energy that includes 3 other institutions up and down the Atlantic seaboard. And all of this is focused on looking at alternative energy resources that are renewable, thinking about the wave energy that we have off our coast. Step out a little bit further, we have this incredible energy resource called the Gulf Stream. And so looking at opportunities of harnessing some of that energy, not necessarily to go grid scale right away, but maybe for some niche opportunities. So thinking about a recent program that we ran in partnership with the Department of Energy was something called Waves to Water. And so if you are, say, an island nation or an island community and you don't have power, and in fact, for us, our drinking water is driven by having power, so you can run pumps and push it through a reverse osmosis system. If you don't have power, you don't get drinking water. But we have significant energy just off our coast. And so this was thinking about and getting the innovators together, those engineers and those minds that can really think about the widgets that you might develop to actually harness the energy of waves to create fresh water from salt water. And they had to do that from a box that was a 5 by 5 by 5 that you could ship anywhere in the world. And so we deployed 5 of these off of Jeanette's Pier, which we have a strong partnership with Jeanette's Pier. So basically taking an idea to this prize where some of these innovators won almost $1 million based on those gadgets, those widgets, the engineering that was behind it and the business plan that they put together. And so we are looking for innovation in the way that we can develop and think about the energy resources that we have off our coast. I'm not going to get into wind energy. That's a very interesting topic. I'm happy to answer questions with it. But as we think about developing that resource, which we are not focused on, but thinking about those partnerships with Avangrid and Duke Energy, such that as we develop that resource, can we tap into those same lines and harness wave energy or sort of grid scale energy from the Gulf Stream? So that's some of our focus from the engineering, from understanding the environmental impacts associated with moving in that sort of direction. So that's a quick introduction into the Coastal Studies Institute and some of the work that we're doing. I did bring some information. Feel free to grab anything off of that table. Feel free to visit our campus. We are on Roanoke Island, just head towards Wanchese. We're on the right. We're that building that everybody looks at and says, what in the world is that? Right, so that's us. Feel free to drive on by. It's a public place. It's a state facility. We're open 8 to 5. You're welcome to walk around. Don't take anything. Don't walk in the labs. We don't want you getting hurt. But I'm here tonight to sort of talk about coastal change, to talk about some of the interesting history, some of our present, and then sort of look forward into the future of what our coastal system might look like. And it's important to recognize that our coast, as well as coasts around the globe, are a boundary, right? It is this boundary between land and ocean. I've been working at this boundary for, well, a long time now. Actually, I don't like to think about it. For about 25, 26 years, I've been sort of really focused on this boundary between land and ocean. And at this boundary, we have barrier islands, we have marshes, we have estuaries. These are critical habitats to our community, to thinking about our food resources, to the ecology of this planet when you really get down to it. And so these are really important boundaries. But it's also important to recognize that as these boundaries between land and sea change, as they shift, right, so do these landscapes that we're talking about. And as these landscapes shift, so does the habitability, where we are. Those begin to move. And this is important to recognize and important to think about as we build on this context of coastal change. And so, many of my slides, I'll try to orient you to where we are, what we're talking about. And so, I'll sometimes refer to the inner banks versus the outer banks. And so I think we are all familiar with the outer banks, which is this, beautiful linear line of barrier islands. The inner banks are sort of that low-lying area on the interior part of the Albemarle-Pamlico estuarine system, which is the second largest estuarine system in the U.S. And so I'll probably sometimes refer to the inner banks versus the outer banks. But it's important to recognize that as these landscapes do change, as these boundaries between land and ocean change, so do these environments, the ecology of these systems, the hydrology of the systems, and the geomorphology, right? How these landscapes are made up. And that's sort of what I want to talk about, is some of these changes that are going to be taking place how they've changed in the past, what it might look like in the future. And change is nothing new for coastal North Carolina, or pick your favorite coast around the globe. For coastal North Carolina, we've seen change since we've been able to develop maps, right? And so this is one of the early maps, the Moseley map of 1733. This is showing Roanoke Island here. Duck would be somewhere up here. From 1733, 1770, 1808 to 1833. And you can see some of this is just differences in maps, but some of this really is the changes that took place during that time. Changes in the location of inlets, changes in what sea level was at that time relative today. And so the idea of coastal change is nothing new. What might be different today is if we look at, and so I grabbed an image, a stock image that I found after doing a quick search on, you gotta love Google. And so this is is anybody in the Carolina Dunes area? All right, so this is an 1980 circa map, not map, but aerial image of the Carolina Dunes area in Duck. And this is roughly 40 years later, right? So coastal change isn't different, right? We have seen coastal change along North Carolina. We have seen coastal change throughout the globe. What is different is that we have developed much of our coast. I live on the coast, and so I'm not suggesting that's a bad thing. It's just something that we have to recognize, right? You can't separate coastal change from the development that we have across our coast. And so this will always come together in something that we should think about as we sort of think through some of the science, some of the changes that are taking place. Today is different than it has been in the past. All right, so my goals today are to sort of think about different timescales, both in the past and the future. So I'm going to start with a quick lesson, like a 2-slide lesson. I'm going to get you through a few million years in 2 slides. To sort of think about coastal evolution, primarily from a sea level perspective. Again, as we are talking about the coast, we are really talking about that connection between land and ocean. And that connection is determined by where the sea level lies, right? Where your shoreline is, that interaction. And so what sea level has done over different timescales is really important for understanding coastal change. So I'm going to give you a quick window into the past such that we can understand a little bit of the future. Geologists love to say, and I am not a geologist, I sometimes play one on TV, but the geologists often say the past is a window into the future. Right? If we don't understand the past, how can we predict the future? And so we study the past a lot. I'll talk about some of the modern processes, right? The drivers of change today, the drivers of change over the last century and what's really happening today. And then we'll try to take that and understand what it looks like for the future, right? Projecting out. I certainly will show projections out to 2100, and I'll talk about that too, right? Anytime you start projecting into the future, right, there's error associated with that. They can barely predict the weather tomorrow, and that's challenging, but again, a lot of this is based on our understanding, the physical sciences and the understanding of what we have seen in the past, understanding that to project forward. So that's the goals today, and then I'll open it up to if there's any questions, or I'll wake those up that fall asleep. All right, so a quick history lesson. Again, this is taking it back about 1 million years, and so I'll try to always orient you with what we're looking at. So North America, this is stepped back, and this is showing an image of the peak ice age, our last ice age, right, which was about 20,000 years ago. And so this is an image of North America about 20,000 years ago. What this graph is showing you is essentially temperature. All right, it's a proxy for temperature over the last 1 million years. 0 represents present, 1 represents 1 million years in the past. The red color represents warmer temperatures. The cool, obviously blue color, represents colder temperatures. And so this shows you what climate has essentially done over the last 1 million years, right? It hasn't been the same. It's been changing. It has been changing for millennia. If I want to think about just the last roughly 125,000 years, because the last 125,000 years represents a cycle that we are often in, a cycle between what we refer to as an interglacial versus a glacial, right? So the last interglacial was roughly 125,000 years. That's the last time it was as warm as it is today. And then we have our last glacial maximum. That's when we had a lot of ice over this planet, like what you see here with this very large ice sheet sitting right over North America. And in fact, this ice sheet at about New York was about a mile thick, sitting on top of New York State, right? So huge amounts of ice. All right, so we need to think about that as how sea level shifts between a glacial period when we are dominated by ice versus the interglacial period like what we're in today, where the planet has some ice, but certainly not as much ice, and most of that water is found in the oceans. All right, so if we bring this a little bit closer and also reduce the scale a little bit. So I'm showing 3 graphs here, and these 3 graphs on the right side is modern, on the left side of this graph is 150,000 years in the past. So remember, 125,000 years ago represents the last interglacial period. That's when it was as warm as it was today. And then 20,000 years ago, sitting right here, let me go to this. So 20,000 years ago was the last glacial period, when we had all of that ice sitting over North America and also over many other continents. So, what I'm trying to get to here is that we have had significant changes in sea level in the past. And with changes in sea level, lead to changes in where that shoreline is. All right, so the black line versus the blue line represent differences in where the shoreline has been in the past. The last interglacial, our shoreline was actually right along this dotted black line. This is referred to as the Suffolk Scarp. This Suffolk Scarp is at approximately 15 feet above modern sea level, above where we are today. Right, so the last warm period, the last interglacial, sea level was much higher than it was today. All right, the Outer Banks didn't exist. Much of eastern North Carolina, much of the Inner Banks didn't exist. And this is where that shoreline was 125,000 years ago. 20,000 years ago, we were in this deep glacial period with so much of our water from the ocean caught up in ice and glaciers. And we actually had sea level much lower than it was today, where sea level was at about the continental shelf, the end of the continental shelf, what we refer to as the shelf break. And so sea level was about 300 feet lower than it is today. And so we see these incredible changes in what sea level is doing over scales of millennia. Okay, and so over the last 125,000 years, we have had shifts in sea level of over 300 feet. Okay, and we can see this, and there's plenty of evidence, both fossil as well as data in North Carolina, that show these what we refer to as paleo shorelines. And so we've seen this change, and if we sort of bring this to thinking about that relationship, let me step back real quick. And so I didn't tell you about these graphs that I'm showing you over on the left here. And so this first one is looking at CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Again, remember, on the right side is modern, on the left is the past, back to 150,000 years. This represents the average temperature of the planet, right? So again, that's average temperature over the globe. And then this represents what sea level is doing in response. These are all connected, right? The amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, which creates this radiative blanket, the global temperatures, and how temperatures then regulate how much water we have as liquid water in the oceans or frozen water that's on our ice caps, right? All of these things are related on different timescales. And so let's sort of bring it a little bit closer to modern times. If we look at what's happened over the last century or so, we can look at some significant changes that are occurring over sort of the globe. And this one's looking at temperature. This is looking at global temperatures, and this sort of gives you a spatial understanding of what global temperatures were between the late 1800s, and this is relative to a period of 1951 to 1980. And so if you take global temperatures for that 30-year period, 1951 to 1980, and you average them, that represents 0, and this represents the difference between that 30-year average. And so in the late 1880s, it was cooler than that 30-year average. And then between 2017 and 2021, it's warmer. If you want to look at it just in time, that's what this graph is showing you here. This goes from 1880 to 2021. This is looking at sort of that, what it's doing on a global scale each year and how it's changing over the last 100 or so. So what we're seeing is sort of spatial differences across the planet, but on a whole, we're seeing that our planet was cooler in the past and certainly is warmer today. This shouldn't be news. These are things we're experiencing. It's things that you have heard about for years now. But again, just trying to drive some of this home. So with a warming planet, we're starting to see some changes. So for instance, this is showing the Muir Glacier in Alaska, an image from 1941 versus an image from the same location in 2004, differences in the amount of ice that's present, right? And you can see this, Greenland, the Antarctic, right? Pick any major glacier, and these sorts of changes are occurring across our planet. When you look at the average ocean temperature, and so this is actually looking at, spatially, looking at what ocean temperatures are doing today, and this is relative to an early 1900s temperature. And so we're seeing temperatures in the ocean, this is the surface ocean, that are on the order of about 3 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, approximately 1 degree Celsius, warmer today than in the past. This is important for many reasons. It's not just the atmosphere that's warming, right, which is what I was showing you in that previous image, but the temperature of the ocean is also increasing. Now remember, the ocean is large, covers 70+% of this planet. It's quite deep. This is an average of the surface ocean. The surface ocean represents about the top 300 feet of the ocean, okay? So it's still an incredible amount of water. The surface ocean is holding an incredible amount of energy. And the fact is when water, good old H2O, changes temperature, it also changes the amount of space it takes up. Right, so that's important to recognize. The difference in space that ice takes up versus liquid water. And so as liquid water starts to warm up, it starts to take more space. That H2O begins to spread out a little bit more. At a molecular level, you put it on the scale of that much water, and it really does make a difference. And in fact, just that change in temperature is part of why we're seeing sea level increase. That 1 degree Celsius, or that approximately 4 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature of the surface ocean. All right, so we're seeing climate change. And I'm not really here to talk about climate itself, but the implications of that. I'm certainly happy to answer questions about climate. I'm certainly to talk about why it's changing. The fact is we could argue, if you want, about why climate is changing. It doesn't matter at this point why it's changing. We can document climate change, whether it's our fault, whether it's somebody else's fault, or whether it's natural. Who cares? Because it's changing and we are in the way, right? We have to think about how it's changing. Now, why it's changing is important because that helps us address that change. But again, for this presentation, and again, I'm happy to answer questions, and I'm always interested in the questions. The fact is, we can document the changes that are taking place, and that is leading to some significant physical changes along our coastal systems. So the idea that climate is changing is leading to some problems, some challenges along our coast. And that's sort of what I want to focus on for the next, how much time you got? And so I wanted to touch on this term because I might hit on it a few times, and I wanted to go ahead and introduce it and sort of define it in case I do say it many times. It's probably something you've heard yourself often, particularly over the last couple of years, is the idea of coastal resilience. Right? We want to become more resilient. And we talk about climate, we talk about coastal change, and coastal resilience is part of this solution. And what in the world does that mean? So I'm going to define it here. And again, I define it purposefully because I might bring it up myself. I provide a definition that is given by the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resilience. This is a fairly new North Carolina office established by Governor Cooper, I think about 3 years ago, shortened as NCORE, so you might hear NCORE. The definition, I'll read it because it's kind of small. A resilient North Carolina is a state where our communities, economies, and ecosystems are better able to rebound positively adapt to and thrive amid changing conditions and challenges, including disasters and climate change, to maintain and improve quality of life, healthy growth, and durable systems, and to conserve resources for present and future generations. So the idea is that we can better respond, we can better, in their words, rebound to something. That might be a storm, that might be a significant rain event, it might be significant erosion that's taking place, it could be a named storm like a hurricane. Right, so the idea is that we prepare for that next, you name it, right, that next event, such that when that event takes place, we are better prepared for it, we don't have as much damage, we get back to normal, whatever that is today, quicker. And in fact, what you're seeing today is more than just a rebound, the idea of we want to be able to bounce forward, such that we have plans in place so we aren't just getting back to normal. We actually have plans in place so we become more resilient, so we're even more prepared the next time a storm hits. And that takes all of you. It takes community input to think about how we can become more resilient, not just to prepare for the storm that might take place tomorrow, but for the storm, the hurricane, the flood that might take place in 10, 15, or 20 years. So the idea of bouncing forward, thinking about some of the things I'm going to talk about, thinking about the next 20 years as we start putting these plans in place. So I think that's becoming much more important, is to really take the science, sort of digest that science, talk about it such that you're preparing for the changes, not what's happening today. And it does take a community. It isn't about just, well, some of it is political will, but it does take sort of bringing the economics into it, thinking about those, that social interaction that we have today, what we want it to look like tomorrow. It's not just about the science that I'm presenting, and I totally understand that. I understand that more today than I have in the past, and I work with social scientists, and I see the significance. And in fact, the changes that are going to take place today aren't going to be based on the science I'm going to present to you tonight. It's going to be based on the conversations that you have and working with your leaders. All right, if we are going to become more resilient, if we can talk about resilience moving forward, then we have to start by understanding the vulnerability. We need to understand where we should be more resilient. So every community might be a little bit different. So we sort of need to look at this at a community or regional scale. And when you think about Eastern North Carolina, right, so I showed this, I've sort of been showing this map a lot. What this map is showing is the elevation difference, right? So the darker browns represent higher elevations. I'm only going up to about 18 feet. It does get higher in elevation as you go further inland, but who cares? Right, what we're really interested in is the coast. And so, it is interesting to note that, these first two colors, sort of this, puke green and pink, right, represents only up to about 2 or 3 feet above sea level. 2 or 3 feet above sea level. And, you see how much of the outer and inner banks are just a couple feet above sea level today. All right, that is important to recognize. And I'm not suggesting we don't have some high, in Duck we have plenty of areas that are higher than 3 feet above sea level. On average, we are sitting fairly low in Eastern North Carolina. Important to recognize for our vulnerability. We do stick out a little bit in the Atlantic. These are named storms. These don't represent, our winter storms, right, our nor'easters, which can be worse, and certainly I recognize that. We often talk about hurricanes or the tropical systems. We do have 2 tropical systems out there right now, and they can be extremely damaging. But look over the last 2 years. I mean, the fact is these nor'easters can be as bad, if not worse. They provide the same winds, they provide the same waves, they just do it over a week at times. Right? So they can be just as bad. And that's something that we have to educate others about because they only think about the named storms. And so that's important that others that are working with this recognize it is a year-round thing. It's not just June through November. And so we have significant storms, we're low-lying, sea level is rising, which I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. So all of these things are important to recognize, and you can't do that in a vacuum. You have to do it while you're also thinking about us, right? The communities, where we've developed, what that looks like, what we're willing to do moving forward. All right, so now I'm going to give you sort of a quick education on sea level. We've talked about climate, we've talked about how temperatures are changing. I tried to show you that connection between as temperatures are changing, there is this connection with sea level. The exact drivers of sea level change over the last 100 years do vary. And I've tried to put some of that on this particular slide. And so this is looking at the last 120 years of what we refer to as eustatic sea level. Scientists always want to come up with these great words. This just means global sea level, right? This is a global average of how sea level is changing. So eustatic is referring to the global ocean, right? So you can think of global ocean, eustatic, or relative sea level, which is how it's changing here, right? And the drivers of that are slightly different. How relative sea level changes, how it's changing here, takes into account everything that's happening on the global level, but other things that might be happening here in Duck. How the Gulf Stream is changing, how the land mass might be changing, right? So it takes into account those local changes that are taking place when you're talking about relative. On a global scale, again, so this is global sea level change, so eustatic change. This is looking at roughly the last 120 years. This is a compilation of data from around the globe that includes tide gauge data. We have satellites that are, for the last 20 years or so, have been collecting data of elevation of the ocean as well as our land masses. And ultimately what we're seeing is this change that's sort of constant over the last 120 years, this constant rise in sea level. And when you look at it at different scales, if you look at the early 1900s versus the last 30 years, the rate of change is significantly different as well. And so in the early 1900s, we had a rise in sea level, and I apologize, I can try to do this in my head on the fly. As a scientist, I try to use metric, and so apologies. You know, it's funny, Stephen Colbert, anybody watch the Colbert Report? He doesn't exist anymore, but he's saying something about, people are talking about in millimeters, but it doesn't matter because that doesn't exist. That makes no sense because we don't use it, right? So how can it make sense? And so I try to make some of these conversions where I can. So in the past, sea level rise in the early 1900s was about 1.2 millimeters a year. What's important, again, maybe ignore the rate. What's important today is we're at a rate of about 3.7 millimeters per year on a global scale. About 3 times higher today than it was in the early 1900s. Okay, so the rate, it's not just that sea level's rising, it's that rate of rise is changing as well, right? Sea level is changing faster today than it was 100 years ago. So that's also important to recognize. The drivers of that change during the different time periods are sort of shown here. So early in the 1900s, it was the mountain glaciers and the Greenland ice cap that was a real driver. Today, it really is sort of the Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheets that are the primary sources of water to the ocean that are creating the rise. When you go to the late 1900s, early 2000s, steric changes, so temperature changes were really important. And so depending on that timeline, there are different primary drivers that are leading to that change. Today, it's primarily glaciers. Land, basically these glaciers that are primarily on land that are essentially melting faster than ever before, adding water to the ocean. So we're going to bring it a little closer to home. We'll start talking about some of the vulnerability of North Carolina. Keep that idea of that global scale sea level in the back of your mind. So global mean sea level has increased, right, since 1901. We understand that. Again, over the last 100 years, we've seen about a 1 foot increase in sea level. And I'll say that again because I'm going to bring it back up later. Over the last 100 years in North Carolina, we've seen about a 1 foot increase in sea level. Okay, the last 100 years. Current rate of sea level is certainly higher than it's been in the last 150 years or so, or more. When you start looking at the vulnerability of coastal states, this is a USGS document that came out in the late 90s, early 2000s. And the different colors, the greens, happy coastlines, the oranges and reds are a little bit more vulnerable. And certainly, North Carolina sticks out there in the orange and red as well as Chesapeake Bay. And so our region was considered fairly vulnerable even in the late 90s, early 2000s. Part of that is being driven by our low-lying coastal system, right? We're only 1 to 3 feet above sea level across much of the inner and outer banks. And so with a small rise in sea level, you start flooding significant areas. And so that's part of the reason that we are fairly vulnerable. And I've shown you some of those other reasons, right? We have these major storms, we sort of stick out. And so those are some of these drivers of change. Relative sea level isn't the same across coastal systems, right? The rate of sea level here in Duck, Nags Head, isn't the same as Wilmington, right? Our sea level rise rate here in Duck is about twice that of Wilmington, North Carolina, right? So that relative sea level rise rate is really important. In Alaska, there are communities that are facing sea level fall, right? So the idea of relative sea level rise or relative sea level change is really important. What's happening here is very different than what's happening in Florida. It's different than what's happening in Oregon, Alaska. Pick your community. And just in North Carolina, as far as a management perspective, right, what's happening in Duck is different than what's happening in Morehead City, which is different than what's happening in Wilmington. And so you have to consider what's happening in your community when you start addressing some of these vulnerabilities. And so it's important to recognize, and that's sort of bring you home as close as we can almost get to North Carolina, to think about the differences in our coast. And so if we were to break up the coast between a northern and southern province, it really is sort of right along this line that sort of lands right about Cape Lookout. And there's real significant difference between the northern province versus our southern neighbors here in North Carolina. And I've sort of described some of those here. The rest of the talk really is going to make some comparisons between Duck and Wilmington. And I've been a part of several committees for North Carolina, different science panels, and developing some of these curves moving forward and understanding of some of the challenges. And so it's important to understand these differences between the northern versus the southern part of our states as we start looking at vulnerability, particularly from a sea level perspective. And so, when you're here in northern North Carolina, fairly gentle deposition topography, right? So we're fairly low lying, and it's very, very slow change in topography, where when you get further south, it's more rapid change along the coast. You can gain elevation a lot quicker. We have these really wide sounds, right? So the back barrier sounds are extremely large. Those barriers stick much further out into the Atlantic compared to those very narrow estuarine systems to our south. I mean, this becomes pretty important as if anybody's been here for 10 years or so, right? We've had as much flooding from the sound side as we have from the Atlantic side. And that is being driven by, again, the second largest estuarine system in the nation, with the Albemarle-Pamlico system. And so these are things that we have to take into account. And so when we look at sea level, and I sort of gave away this punchline, when we look at sea level in North Carolina, it's important to recognize that because of this difference that we have across our state, we do see very different rates of sea level change in North Carolina. And the driver of that primarily, I showed you an early image of that huge glacier that was sitting on the northern part of our continent, right? And so again, about a mile thick of ice sitting over the state of New York. Well, when that was there 20,000 years ago, you can imagine the weight of that water just bearing down on the continent, right? So that what truly was pressing down on the continent. Well, all that ice is now retreated, and so the continent is finally stretching, right? It's slowly rebounding, what we refer to as isostatic rebound, right? So it's slowly stretching its legs, coming up after that huge weight of ice that was on it. And you can imagine a teeter-totter, okay? And we are right at that center point, or I should say Wilmington is right at that center of the teeter-totter, right? So the teeter-totter was sitting this way with all that ice sitting on New York. We were sitting here and Wilmington's there. With all that ice gone, that teeter-totter's slowly coming up. And the center of that teeter-totter doesn't move, right? As you get closer to New York, it changes even more drastically. For us, we are slowly, and so I sort of got that wrong. I should have said, I should never admit when I'm wrong. So here at Duck, we are slightly sinking on a scale of 1 millimeter per year, right? So I told you that global sea level is changing at about 3.7 millimeters per year. Sea level rise in Duck is approximately, when you look at it for the scale that we have from the FRF pier, is 4.79 millimeters per year. We're about a millimeter higher than global, and that is driven by changes not in the ocean, but changes of the land mass itself is slightly sinking by a millimeter a year. And so you have sea level rising, you have the land sinking, which leads to a change of about 4.7, 4.8 millimeters a year. And so that's where we are today with Wilmington at about 2.8. Right? We're about double compared to the southern part of the state. And that is a product of what we refer to as subsidence, right? So the land mass is slightly sinking. There are other things that can change sea level in Duck, as well as other places, on short time scales, right? Dominant wind fields, as those change, can change what sea level is doing. I mentioned the Gulf Stream. As the strength of the Gulf Stream changes, that will change sea level for eastern North Carolina. The difference in sea level between the coast of North Carolina versus Bermuda is a meter, 3 feet. You stop the Gulf Stream, that goes like that. I'm not saying the Gulf Stream's going to stop. I'm just saying if, right? And so, anyway, I mean, those things are important to recognize, right? It's an extremely dynamic system, right? It is complicated. But what's good is we're getting a handle on the science, understanding the changes and how these changes interact, right? It's not linear. One interacts with another. And that's what's important to really recognize. All right, so take this into account, the differences between Duck and Wilmington, because I'm going to show you a few more slides making these differences, thinking about these comparisons moving forward. And so this is something we've been working on, is not just thinking about what's happened over the last 100 years or so, but really trying to make a comparison to what sea level is doing relative to climate, right? Again, if we want to project forward, we need to understand a better connection between what global temperatures, what CO2 in the atmosphere, and what sea level is doing. So I've worked with a team of scientists, and I'm certainly not leading this team by far, but we've probably put together one of the best records of sea level change in the world. And it's actually from a core that we collected in a marsh right off the new bridge that comes on to Roanoke Island. Right, what we refer to as Sand Point, and that's just because there was a sandy point in the area where we came ashore. But I mean, what's incredible is North Carolina has one of the deepest, best records of sea level around the world. This is a 2,000-year record from coastal North Carolina on Roanoke Island. We actually take this back as far as 5,000 years in the past. Data gets a little bit worse as you go further back, but this last 2,000 years, the shaded area represents our error associated with our measurements of sea level in the past. What these boxes represent are different anomalies in climate in the past. This is referred to as the medieval climate anomaly. This is referred to as the Little Ice Age. These are global changes in temperature that took place in our not too distant past, right? So again, this is only taking it back a few hundred years with a major change in what climate was doing, both warming and cooling, and looking at response of sea level in North Carolina to those changes. And so we've sort of taken this sort of data to really, and I'm showing you for North Carolina, we have this data from, from about Maine down to Florida along the Atlantic coast, where we've collected these cores primarily in marsh environments, because marshes, if they don't keep up with sea level, they disappear. And so a marsh today, depending on how long that marsh has been there, we will have a great record of sea level. And the Outer Banks have been around for about 5,000 years. And so those marshes on the backside of the Outer Banks, if we can find a marsh that is deep enough, that has been around long enough, that organic sediment, that peat that's deposited, it doesn't go anywhere. It's a great record of historic, right? So long-term sea level. And so that's where we can get an almost 5,000-year record of sea level from this one location on Roanoke Island. It was about 30 feet of peat 10 meters of peat, of that organic material. Awesome core, and some great data that we've been able to get from North Carolina. Anyway, my point with this is sort of making that connection between different climate change that is taking place and sea level, so we can sort of think about how that works moving forward. And so that's where we get into some of these projections into the future, is understanding those connections, understanding what we have seen in the past, and then certainly these projections moving out forward are based on some predictions of what we're going to do primarily with CO2 in the atmosphere. And from what CO2, the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, which create that radiative blanket, we can say something about global temperatures. And from that, we can say something about sea level. And so that's how we come up. I've distilled it down, right? I mean, these are fairly complicated models, but distilling it down, that's the relationship. And so when we look at these, and so these different scenarios are based on what we think CO2 is going to be in the atmosphere. And from that, we make projections of temperature and then sea level. And so these are all based, taking it out about 100 years, again, out to 2100, different. So this is very low. If we were to essentially stop producing CO2 by 2050, stop burning fossil fuels by 2050, that's what that represents. RCP 4.5 is sort of, we're not changing that much. We're getting a little bit better in how we're burning fossil fuels in 4.5. And 8.5 is, we're doing worse than what we are doing today in production of CO2. And so, the more science comes out, this is probably, pretty extreme, especially in the trajectory of us, and when I say us, globally us, and how we're approaching renewables and how we're approaching evaluating climate and CO2 production. And so we are very likely on this route, very unlikely on this route, okay? And so what this is showing is projections of sea level based on these three different projections of what we expect CO2 to look like in the future. The reason I have this image here is because this is from 2013. And in 2013, there was still a lot of questions about climate change. In 2012, I was part of, sorry, I'm going a little long. In 2012, I was part of the group that put out the first sea level curves for North Carolina. And that was a rude awakening for, I'd like to think of myself as a young scientist then, but maybe not that young of a scientist. But it's the first time that I really sort of got into the political aspects of science. I'd always just been out doing science for my own science sake and really interested in what I was doing, but maybe it wasn't as applied as some of what I'm talking about tonight. I was one of the authors of that 2012 sea level, and that 2012 sea level report made international news. North Carolina made international news when we tried to outlaw sea level rise. And I don't know if y'all remember this or not. We were on the Colbert Report. We, as in North Carolina, were on the and we were a laughing stock, which was, we've come a long way since 2012. But it was an eye-opener for me of how political, how hot-button issue these sorts of things are. I was just putting in the science, it's just science, That's how I approached it. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so one of the reasons I put in one of these old images, right? This is 2013, and the projections in 2013 were the extreme was at about 1 meter. These are from 2019, 6 years later, a lot better science. The projections go as high as about 1 meter. When you look at where we are today, we are sitting right in line on the high end of these projections from 2013, right? Again, notice this data only goes out to about 2007. That's what this image was based on. We have a lot more data to add to this, and we are on the high end of the projections from 2013. These scientists weren't nuts when they started putting these projections. Now we're starting to really wrangle this in and understanding out in 2100 what that might look like, right? The range, and the range, and I'll state it outright, the range that we have today doesn't go as high as 1.2, and we think this is pretty extreme today. Is a meter possible? Certainly. maybe not by 2100, right? So that's another thing to think about. It's not like after this, everything goes back to normal. These are trends that go beyond 2100. There's no point in showing it. There's a lot more error. But time doesn't stop at 2100, right? So these trends continue on that sort of trajectory. So that's another thing to think about. NOAA put out a report last year in February. One of the things I mentioned earlier is that we have seen a 1-foot rise in sea level in the last 100 years. NOAA put out a report last February. I've never seen, so NOAA is the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration. They are doing a lot on coastal research, coastal resilience, and coastal understanding. They put out a report that said, very definitive. I have never seen them be so adamant about the change. We have seen a 1-foot rise in sea level in the last 100 years. Coastal North Carolina will see a 1-foot rise in sea level by 2050. In less than 30 years, we are going to see a foot rise. Now, that foot rise isn't from today. That foot rise, I think, is from 2017, right? And so, again, but by 2050, we will see approximately 1-foot rise in sea level. It tells you something about the rate. It took 100 years to provide 1 foot. We're going to see that in about 30. These values are real, and these are things that we have to take into account today. When you look at the differences in sea level projections for North Carolina, and so I should have said this image is showing globally. This is for North Carolina, and it's making a comparison between Duck and Wilmington. It's projecting out to 2100, and this projection is based on the likely rate, right? So this isn't, outlandish. It is not the extreme. It is based on the likely projection. These are data that we did 2 years ago. If you go out to 2050, on this side of the scale is feet. If you go out to where's my clicker? There. If you go out to 2050, you will see that this sits, actually the projection for this is actually a little bit above 1 foot. The projection for Wilmington is sitting right at 1 foot. And so our projections from about 2 years ago are in line with what NOAA put out last year, that by 2050, we should see a foot rise in sea level. What that means sort of on the ground, particularly for coastal environments, is as you start getting into higher sea levels, you're going to start seeing higher inundation. Water coming over the shores, water coming over into streets, water coming up sewers, right? So we're going to start seeing more water in coastal environments. What this graph is doing is taking this idea of high tide flooding or sunny day flooding as actual daily tides change, when you might expect to see floodwaters, ocean waters in the streets, and how often you might see it throughout a year. And so again, when you start getting into 2050, you're seeing in Wilmington about 50 days, and sort of this area, I say Duck, it doesn't mean necessarily the town of Duck, the data's from Duck, right, it's from the FRF Pier. But you're starting to see maybe as much as a third of the year with waters high enough to create what we refer to as sunny day flooding. And again, you can extend that beyond based on that continued rise in sea level. So that's sort of looking at the past, right? Making those connections, starting to project those forward. What I want to show is that, this isn't abstract. We're seeing these changes today. I want to give a couple examples of the implications of that. So one is the conversion of forest to marsh, the idea of creating ghost forest. There's been several articles coming out, primarily actually a group at NC State University, focused on understanding this transition in these coastal environments, these ecological systems that are going from primarily forested to marsh. And when you do that, you leave those trees there standing for a while, creating what appears to be this ghost forest. And so with time, and this is showing time and the increase in hectares, the area that you actually see dead trees, ghost forest, you're starting to see that increase. You can see that across much of the Albemarle Peninsula. Just go, across the old Mans Harbor Bridge into sort of obviously Mans Harbor, North Point, that area. You'll see great, pretty large extents of ghost forest. You're starting to see a lot of the Albemarle Peninsula actually get salty, right? So the Albemarle Peninsula, so I'm thinking sort of just mainland from us, that is an area that has had significant agriculture for many, many, many years, right? It was ditched and drained in order to allow for that agriculture to take place. but their soils are starting to see much more salt today. That's a product of higher inundation from Pamlico Sound. That's a product of, obviously, and from higher sea levels to where it's becoming, I'm not saying that you can't grow crops anymore, but the crops, it's becoming more challenging to grow those crops. Farmers are starting to move away from land. They're starting to transition land into different crops. Many are transitioning those land into solar, right? You're starting to see a lot more solar. I'm not going to say that's because of this, but we're starting to see transitions of that ag land into other things. And then for us, I've been on the news a lot lately. I don't know why I popularized myself. Over the last year, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but we've had a couple houses taken by the ocean. That has led to an opportunity for me, actually, to do just this, right? Anytime I get the opportunity to talk to people, what might be through CBS News or some other organization, I will. I have never said no, because I will take that opportunity, not because I do want to be famous, but because I want to get this message out there. I think it's critical that we have a better understanding holistically of the vulnerability. We have an understanding of the processes that are leading to some of these changes. That no, it's not that we just built those houses there. Those houses had hundreds of feet of sand in front of them when they were built, right? I mean, seeing some of the comments to these stories drives me insane. And it's because they don't understand the process, right? We aren't crazy in some of the places that we've built. The place has changed, right? The coast is changing. That's why we're here. And so clearly there are challenges, right? And things that we have to think about. And these are leading to some environmental challenges as well along the Park Service land. And so that's something that has come up again as well. And so with sea level rise, with some of these coastal hazards, we are dealing with erosion. I'll show an image of that. We're because we're low-lying, we're sort of dealing with a lot of storm events, and certainly we're starting to see more flooding. So some of the things we should expect moving forward are these increases in sunny day flooding. And so I showed that with sea level rise, and I'll show you an image of that in just a second. So this is the town of Manio, a picture I took. It was the day before Christmas, I think. Day before, day after. We had a big blow. We had sort of a big southwest blow for about 8 hours, I think. And I just sort of rode my bike down to Manio and snapped that picture. Beautiful sunny day, 1 foot of water in the road, right? That was just a product of the wind. That wasn't driven by tides, but the fact is Pamlico Sound isn't driven by astronomical tides, it's driven by wind tide, right? And with the stronger wind, or with the same 40-knot wind we had 20 years ago, today it's gonna have a different response, right? So that sort of mentality, we need to start getting that, thinking about that as we move forward, thinking about the vulnerability. We all know about erosion, some of the things that we're trying to deal with, shoreline erosion. This is something that we are focused on at the Coastal Studies Institute. I've done a lot of work on beach nourishment, understanding the impacts, the ecological impacts of beach nourishment. I'm happy to talk about that and the implications of what we can do with some of this erosion. Not going to dwell on it here. One of the things I want to point out is we aren't just dealing with erosion on the front side, some images from various storms, but we have to recognize that we have water and a big water body on our backside as well. We are actually eroding from both sides of this island. Our island is slowly narrowing, not everywhere, all right? And so this is where I'm not doom and gloom, and I hope I am not giving you that impression. We do not need to pack up and move. We need to think about the areas that are more vulnerable, the areas that are less vulnerable, where we can invest. This one scares me, to be honest. Most of our communities out here are on septic. When we flush that toilet, it goes not very far into your yard, and it's that dry area in your soils that cleans that water before it gets into the groundwater. I'll be honest, this is what scares me moving forward, is as sea level rises, groundwaters on the island will also rise. And this is already happening in some places. We've got a couple scientists that are working primarily in Nags Head, not because it's worse there, it's just we got a good partnership with the town of Nags Head. And we've been doing studies on understanding groundwater, understanding the implications for wastewater disposal, on-site wastewater disposal. Certainly, when you get a little bit further, I mean, this is something that's happening in those high erosion areas on the beach where you're starting to see some of these septic tanks in the water. That's a challenge, something we need to deal with from a environmental health perspective. But this is something that I think is really important and we need to think about sooner than later. The idea, it's not just water from the ocean, it's not just water from the sounds, it is rainwater. We are seeing differences in precipitation, the amount of precipitation, slowing of the storms, leading to more rain. This is a 2018 storm, actually a house not far from my home in Manio that saw significant water damage from rain, not from inundation from the ocean or from the sound. Again, not doom and gloom. We have challenges. These are challenges that we are mostly aware of. We need to think about those, think about the vulnerabilities. Is there something that we can do? And there are things that we are doing. So the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, put out this image not too long ago in 2019 of different scenarios, different things you can do in response to sea level. There are some that I think aren't worth really sort of spending too much time on. No response, I guess, you could stick your head in the sand, it's not really worth it. The idea of protecting, it's showing a hardened, sort of an engineered shoreline, that is challenging in North Carolina, and I'm happy to have a discussion with it. I actually agree with it. Hardened shorelines lead to bigger challenges down the road. The idea of accommodating, the idea of retreating, the idea of ecosystem-based adaptation. One of the things I want to point out is all of these are important. These are tools in your toolkit. We won't just jump onto one. We will use all of these depending on where we are, what the vulnerability is. And it is important to note that, the idea of a hardened structure that they show here as a way of protecting, well, we have a different way of sort of soft engineering solution, temporary solution, which is nourishment. Accommodating, I think there's a great example, and there's other examples. Accommodating, right? So this is the jug handle bridge that bypasses the S-turns, which was an area that was very vulnerable, couldn't hold the road any longer. This is accommodating the change that's taking place in Rodanthe. And retreat, this is probably the biggest examples that we have of retreat. But look today, there are a lot more examples of retreat along the Outer Banks. I don't know that I would use the word retreat in a presentation I gave 10 years ago, because I don't think they would invite me back. In fact, I think they would grab the pitchforks and chase me out. I think it's important that we use some of this and think about the vocabulary. And I'm not saying, again, I've stated, we don't pack up and move. People are moving. Individuals are making the decision to retreat. Not necessarily leave the Outer Banks, but find a place that's a little bit less vulnerable. Now, these are people that have the means to do it as well, right? So that is challenging. This needs to be equitable. But I just want to make, what I'm doing here is making sure that retreat isn't considered a bad word. Right? It is something that we still think about as we think about all of these things in our toolbox. This, in my opinion, shouldn't be taken out. But it's how if we do keep retreat in the toolbox, it's how we do it. Right? The idea of managed retreat is a management strategy. It's not just individuals doing it because they have the means. They can buy another piece of property. They can pay the $100,000 or more that it's going to cost to move that house. But it's a way that we might do it and think about doing it collectively and how we might finance that collectively so it is equitable. And there are discussions about it. I mean, this was unheard of a decade ago. Again, we've made strides in the last 10 years in accepting some of these challenges, understanding the change, and thinking about what we might do moving forward. And so I have taken a lot of time, a lot more than I had planned on, but I get started and I have a hard time not talking. Sort of summarize, one of the things I sort of want to focus on here is I talked a lot about sort of this side of this graph. And this is a graph, again, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from 2019. This is sort of the climate, the sea level response. This is the hazards, that vulnerability. And then this side is where I think we need to be today, where we needed to be 5 years ago. It's discussions like this. It's working with political leaders. It's your local leaders working with the state and federal, right? It really is having those conversations so that we can become more resilient. And recall, resilience does bring in the community. You cannot become more resilient without each of you. That conversation is critical to us becoming more resilient. And I'll stop there. I talked a lot, and I do. My colleagues say I talk way too much. I am happy to answer any questions. I'm here all night. Yes, sir. I'll try. Yes, sir. That is looking out of my office. From a 30,000-foot, 300-year, I would argue how resilient is anything on the Outer Banks? Right, so I think it's important that we do think scale as we think about what we want, what we can, what's possible, where we invest. Again, I was showing these projections out to 2100. Those projections don't stop there, right? So what we do today has big implications for what those projections do going forward out to 300. Does sea level come down, or does it continue, that's what Colbert said, that ski slope to hell, right? And so does it keep going up? And if it does, yeah. I mean, none of us that are on the Outer Banks will be safe in 300 years. The Outer Banks in 300 years at that scale, I mean, yeah, Jockey's Ridge, you can start building there maybe, right? Because processes all around it would change Jockey's Ridge. And so, I mean, that's challenging, thinking out that scale. What we do today changes the trajectory of those curves. That's what's really important. The longer we wait, the worse those curves get when you take it out to 300 years. I don't know if I answered your question. I tried to skirt your question. Yeah, so I'll tell you, on our property, that area actually takes water during rain. From that perspective, this is probably better. Most of our property sits 15 feet above sea level today, rated for a Cat 3 storm. We do have erosion rates on our edge, on our marsh. In fact, one of our marshes had an erosion rate of up to 10 feet per year averaged over the last 40 years. So we're trying to do something that in partnership with the Nature Conservancy. Would I put it there? I mean, so that's a great question. It's not the first time I've received that. In fact, one of my academic colleagues posted something once that said, the state was irresponsible to build CSI there. And my argument to that is, I'm not saying we should be in a vulnerable area. I don't think over the next 100 years, I don't think CSI is vulnerable. But we also need to be in the community. We need to be in an area that allows us to study the change, that allows us to work with everybody else that is experiencing that change. And we're just as concerned. I'm not saying we didn't build there to be concerned. We do sit high. We are rated fairly high as far as storms are concerned. But yeah, we're going to see some of the same impacts that much of the communities out here do. And we will have to respond to that just like you. Again, I might have skirted it, but. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, it sort of murks the waters.
So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
Indonesia, where their capital, Jakarta, is sinking. So the government, some years ago, outlawed people having wells because you take the land water out of the land.
Subsides.
The country is moving their capital to a whole other place. So the countries are having to take huge steps. And so we, as individuals, need to help our political leaders of our country to do the big steps, and we need you guys to help us as to what we can do with the little steps. And forgetting about the why, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so change is happening. I think we all, I hope we're starting to recognize that. I think it is important to recognize that we are in some interesting change. And, you know, again, I think we want to do this as an individual, and how that scales up from a community to the state to the federal level, I think is really important. And we can make a difference. I think that's really important to recognize. And most of that difference is going to be made at the local level. So I appreciate it. Appreciate the comment.
Quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
Are you familiar with like the product called oceanography and what they're trying to reduce CO2 to sea level?
Vesta.
Yes.
I am. Is that the question? Can I?
The second part of that question is that what you would consider part of a resilience?
I mean, and so the question is, and so for those that didn't hear it, the question is company Vesta that's getting ready to potentially get permitted to put olivine sand just off, sort of near the Duck Pier in that area. You know, am I familiar with that? And is that a way of becoming more resilient? And so I am familiar with it. In fact, I got a couple scientists at CSI that are actually working and helping some of the monitoring that's taking place associated with that, assuming it does get permitted. Olivine sand in the ocean, the idea is it changes the pH slightly in the ocean near this olivine sand. And that change in pH allows the ocean to draw more CO2 into it. The biggest sink for CO2 on this planet is the global ocean. The ocean takes up more than half the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere. And so it's a huge sink for CO2. The question is whether we can add CO2 to the ocean in a way that doesn't affect anything, that doesn't change the ecology, and in a time frame that makes a difference. And so the idea is, for the olivine, is to do just that, is you're adding this olivine, you're slightly changing the pH, which then leads to a drawdown of more CO2 from the atmosphere. Does it lead to a more resilient duck? Probably not, right? Certainly at this scale, right? This is really about, this is research scale. It's not a big project, right? And so at this point, they've done sort of lab scale, they've done a small scale in Jersey, I think. And so this will be sort of one of the larger scales that they've done, but is not on a scale that's gonna make a change to CO2 in our atmosphere. And in my opinion, not on a scale that's gonna change the ecology in our area. And so what's interesting is if you were to do this on a large scale, if they can demonstrate that and so this is, my big question is, you know, this is based on weathering science, right? I mean, this happens every day. When you break down rock, it takes CO2 out of the atmosphere. So what they're trying to do is use natural weathering in the ocean, which, you know, because of that interaction and that water-rock interaction, it can enhance that weathering rate, that you could make that change on a large scale. My question is, does it happen at a rate that's fast enough to really make a difference? And you aren't going to know until you try it. And so that's the challenge. They've demonstrated in the lab that, yeah, this works. They've demonstrated on a larger scale in Jersey that it's not having, I mean, they're showing changes of pH. It's not having any implications to the ecology and that sand environment that they have there. And so this is trying to take it to the next scale, a little bit broader scale, but not on this large scale that could have significant implications without more understanding. Does that answer? Yes, sir. And so if we want to think about what those curves look like in a way that, so again, we're sort of getting into projections of CO2, which then lead to changes in sea level. I mean, I do think we need to think about energy efficiency. That can happen at the individual level as well as scaling that up to communities and state, feds, providing incentives. I mean, the only way that we really, the way we can really make people change is to look for the right incentives. And so, interesting discussions on, how much we want to go from, more traditional fossil fuel burning vehicles to vehicles that are more efficient, that don't put out as much CO2. And you can think of that on not just vehicles, but think about anything that uses fossil fuels and produces CO2. Thinking about how we can better electrify or create more efficient ways of producing that same energy that isn't producing CO2. Those are the policies that we need in place in order to make any change here. All of those projections are, go ahead.
So you talked mostly about using data that you find in North Carolina and global data. Have you talked to other areas in the East Coast that have similar issues?
Yeah, and so I do give a lot of presentations, primarily in North Carolina. I won't lie, I've talked to a lot of communities in North Carolina. Like I said earlier, I will talk to anybody that asks me to. And so if you have an idea of where I might, of the isostatic rebound and the fact that we are sort of on the other side of the teeter-totter, that's where I was getting it wrong. Wilmington is actually changing very little, or in fact, when you look at the last 100 years, Wilmington is slightly rising, right? So, I mean, that's where we're slightly different. So we are slightly sinking, where Wilmington is slightly coming up, a part of sort of some deep rock interaction. And it depends on what scale you look at for Wilmington, whether it's not changing at all or it's changing, less than a millimeter a year, but rising. For North Carolina, some of it's a product of the bookends, and it's a longer tide record, tide gauge that we have at the FRF. You're not the worst. In fact, if you go into Virginia, they actually have higher rates of sea level rise in the tidewater area. Yes, ma'am.
One of your earlier slides showed the temperature of the ocean rising. One area.
To be the same at the equator versus 60 degrees north versus further north. And so this is a long way of trying to skirt your answer, which is I don't know. But we expect there to be differences around the globe. And that's why we do sort of talk about sort of global change, global averages. But I think it's important to look at those local differences, because that can provide some insight into something that maybe we could do different. It can provide insight into what we might expect at that location versus others, is looking at those connections. And I meant to look into it. I didn't. You did catch me. But it's funny that I did see that last night. I was like, oh, I should probably look into that. And I did. Yes, ma'am.
I live in Salem, in Ducks. The first 10 years that we had the house, line of trees and cones. 2012 was a big year.
Yeah.
We got hit by the tornado in April.
Oh, yeah.
And what trees didn't snap off?
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
slowly from 2012 on to Michael was the next big final blow. Took it out, all the trees.
And
My statement is everybody should go home and plant a tree. Preferably an oak.
there you go. And I think we also, as a community, we need to think about not just, when we think about shoreline management, it shouldn't just be ocean shoreline management. We need to think about sound side shoreline management as well. Yes, ma'am.
But what about protecting the sound side, the animals that damage the sound side, like nutria?
Nutria.
Is there a program that Coastal Studies is enacting or involved with to kind of control that animal population that is very damaging to the marsh?
Short answer is no. I mean, we have nutria problem on our own marsh. We do trap nutria on our marsh when we do see active nutria. And so certainly, I mean, that, you know, it's an invasive, like other invasive plants, that it is a challenge that we have to sort of deal with like we do everything else, right? It's a part of the equation. They do create some damage that lead to additional erosion for, you know, marsh plants. And so,
Doesn't seem like there's any sort of formal program to deal with it. We do have it in Duff. We do have them, and they're very active in Duff, right in the town. And they, you know, obviously they're invasive and do damage, but, you know, there is no formal program that I'm aware of to combat.
yeah, and I can't say that I'm aware of one either. It's not something I've really sort of dealt with. But I'd be, you know, I'll certainly look into it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Do you see more beach nourishment happening more often?
How much money you got? I don't see us, beach nourishment is an interesting, it's a great discussion topic. You don't do beach nourishment once. You develop a beach nourishment plan, right? By doing beach nourishment, you don't stop the process that led to you having to do beach nourishment, right? It buys you time. Right? That is what beach nourishment does, is it provides you time to either raise enough money to do the next nourishment, or or raise the next money to do the next nourishment and start having the discussions of what happens, what do we do? We don't have the economics to actually do the next nourishment. What I think we get into is that we do that nourishment, we develop the plan, and so check the box, it's not vulnerable. And that is not the case, particularly when we start thinking about from a county perspective, right? So Rodanthi's trying to get into the game as well, and rightly so, right? Why should they not have money from the county when everybody else is getting it? So it's an interesting discussion to have. But I also think we need to think about, where we should be investing our dollars. Where are the most vulnerable places? Where are the places that we are likely to protect through beach nourishment in a way that allows us to be developing those management plans for the time where we can't do the next nourishment because we don't have the dollars? There will be a time, right? Now it's about every 5 to 6 years. We are getting significant dollars into the county, into the different communities from FEMA based on the monitoring that's being done associated with these different nourishment projects. Will that always be available? Hard to say. And so I do think that we should use the time that we buy, literally buy, by doing that beach nourishment, not just to plan the next one, but to start having the discussions on what we can do in these areas that are vulnerable. And they aren't going to be simple discussions, and there won't be all winners. These are things I recognize, but it doesn't mean that we can ignore it. There will be places that we cannot hold, period. We are seeing that in Rodanthi. It is the start of places we cannot hold. There is talk. If you were at the county commissioners meeting and you listened to it, they brought up that one of our federal representatives is interested in hearing from the county commissioners about whether they want federal dollars for nourishment in Rodanthi. That's a hard thing to really, I have a hard time talking about it. And the reason is because I understand these are people's homes, right? I get that. These are people's, in some cases, livelihoods. In some cases, it's a second home, but that doesn't mean it's not their investment. And so it doesn't just because it's your second home, it doesn't belittle the fact that it's your home. Do I think a nourishment there is going to make a big difference? No. I think you are basically just extending the inevitable. And so if we do a nourishment there, it ought to come with a requirement to have discussions on what you're going to do next. And what's next isn't necessarily a nourishment. We have to have those hard discussions. We have to get together as a community and start thinking about getting the data on those vulnerable areas, really thinking about where we can invest, where we should invest, and thinking about what we're going to do with the areas that we likely can't invest either today or sometime in the future. We will not hold the entire beach. It's a reality, and Bobby Outen doesn't like to talk to me when I say that. I mean, the idea, and that's where the idea of retreat becomes hard. And I get that, I do get that. But I still think we have to talk about it. We need to think about it as a community, not as an individual homeowner. Yes, sir. Sort of managed retreat? Okay. Sure. There, so there are certainly places around the world that are managing coastal change in different ways. You know, we aren't the only ones that are dealing with this. There are places that are seeing similar houses being taken by the ocean. There are other coastal communities that have other problems that we don't necessarily have, that are looking at more about inundation. I mean, look at the Tidewater area as far as sort of, you know, sunny day flooding. We don't see a whole lot of sunny day flooding here at this point, but there are other places that see that a lot today. I appreciate you know, the idea that we have all of these tools in our toolkit. You know, it's not just about retreat, and that's not the only word that I'm using. I hope that doesn't come across that I'm just saying we have to do that. And so yes, and I think what's happening more today is developing those plans as opposed to, I don't think there's a lot of implementing at this point, but really beginning to develop those plans from scales of duck to Miami-Dade, right? These plans are being put together. There's significant investments, millions upon millions of dollars being invested in infrastructure to become more resilient. And there are millions and millions of dollars out there right now for becoming more resilient, using that toolkit. It's about finding the right partnerships, thinking about developing that plan, and really coming together in a way that is meaningful. Yes, sir. Oh. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and so a couple things there. And so I do think we need to start thinking and addressing some of the septic, the on-site wastewater problems that we will likely get into in some locations. And again, it's not going to be all locations anytime soon, but some locations, and some locations are seeing that today. I think, you know, one of the reasons many of the communities have, there's a couple of reasons, you know, a couple of reasons we've seen primarily on-site septic, on-site wastewater systems is because one is to actually keep density lower, right? By moving to a more centralized wastewater, you can actually create more density. And so you turn into the Virginia Beach, you turn into the Brunswick County, right? So there is, you know, whether you would or not, I think, who would say, but certainly with centralized sewer, you can become more and higher density. I didn't want to say more dense. You can increase density. And I think that's something the Outer Banks has done a great job in doing, is not becoming Virginia Beach, not becoming Myrtle Beach. We have really great communities. Yeah, we've seen growth, significant growth over the last 20, 30 years. And it's been done, let me say this. I do think that we need to reevaluate how we develop today such that we're developing, taking these things into consideration. Right? We have to start bringing this into the ordinances for development. We can't develop the same way we did 10, 20 years ago. We're not going to change where we are today. Right? We are where we are, but we can change the way we move forward. And I think we need to do that in a way that takes the science into account. Right, we are where we are today. That's right. We are where we are. And so, but let's work with where we are, right? There's no point in dwelling on where we are. We are where we are, and so let's move forward with that. But we should learn from that, right? The idea is learning from the past and developing today in a way that makes sense, knowing what the changes that are coming. And I agree. I am concerned about, what we do with on-site wastewater moving forward and thinking about, there's technology out there that allows you to not have to have as much soil and that sort of thing. It's not cheap, right? We're gonna have to start thinking about what we do, start putting together programs and incentives to get people to change over such that we don't get into an environmental health issue. I could go all night, but I don't think I will. I certainly appreciate the time. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I've really enjoyed the questions. And so thank you for that.